Hiya, I'd like to take you through the really exciting technique of heat embossing. Now, this is a fantastic technique and it's actually what gets a lot of people into stamping because it's just so magical. So I would like to take you through step by step how you actually heat emboss because it's really easy but the effects are stunning. So in order to heat emboss, what you're going to need is you're going to need some cardstock. Whatever colour, whatever size, whatever type of cardstock you would like, you can use for heat embossing. I've chosen some black cardstock because it creates a really interesting and eye-catching effect. So that's what I'm using for today. You'll need something to mount your stamp onto. I'm using a rare earth load and fold. You can use any stamping platform or acrylic block if you would prefer. You'll of course need a stamp, so I've got this lovely stamp from the Rare Earth Aspirational Sentiments stamp set, which says Dream, Create, Repeat, which is a really nice sentiment, especially if you've got crafty friends that you're giving cards to. You'll also need an ink pad. Now I've got the Rare Earth Clear Glass ink pad here. What you're going to need is an ink pad that's slow drying, so a pigment ink pad is ideal. I've chosen this ink pad because it's clear, so it's not going to interfere with the colour of embossing powder that I've chosen. If you were to use a quick drying ink pad, what you may find is that it dries too quickly to get the embossing powder onto there and you wouldn't actually be able to heat emboss with them. So a pigment ink pad that dries slowly is perfect for heat embossing. In addition, what you're going to need is an anti-static bag. And you're also going to need, finally, and very importantly, is some embossing powder. Of course, though, you're also going to need a heat gun. Now, the difference between a heat gun and a hairdryer is massive. They might look quite similar, especially some of the heat guns that are not a gun model like this, that are more of a hairdryer style model. But a hairdryer is just simply not hot enough. You certainly wouldn't dry your hair with one of these as they get incredibly hot. So do use a little bit of caution when you are using a heat gun, but you can't get away with using a hairdryer for this technique. All you'll end up doing is just blowing the embossing powder away rather than actually melting it, which is what we want to do. Just another little note on your heat guns. There are two main styles of model that we have in the craft market for our heat guns. So this sort of model that I've got here, I've just got the Kit and Caboodle heat gun. You can see it's more of a gun style model, just an on and off. Some models may have two different speeds, a slow one and a faster one, but just on this one we've got just on or off, so it's really simple and easy to use. As well as these gun style models, we also have a type of heat gun that looks more like a hairdryer. Now it's not a hairdryer, but it looks a bit more like one. What they do is they actually disperse the heat over a larger area, which melts the embossing powder a little more slowly. You can get a slightly smoother finish by heating that embossing powder a little more slowly, but by using a gun style of heat gun, what you'll find is it directs the heat in more of a targeted fashion. So it's completely up to you. I tend to prefer the gun style models, but you'll find what works best for you and what you prefer. So on with the actual exciting bit, the heat embossing. So taking my cardstock, as I say, it is black. It's going to give me a really lovely, interesting effect. Taking my stamp, so placing it stamp side, i.e. raised surface side, face down onto the cardstock. I'm just going to close my load and fold to pick up that stamp onto the door, like so. Now I'm going to take my anti-static bag and I'm just going to dust over the surface of my cardstock. Now by doing that, what you'll do is you'll remove the static from there, so you're less likely to get flecks of embossing powder on areas where the stamp isn't. Just gives you a neater finish basically. Taking my clear ink pad, now you can use a coloured ink pad if you would like, but just be aware you'll get a different effect when you apply your embossing powder over the top. I'm just going to ink up my stamp like so. So a nice even coat of ink all over that stamp, and it can be any stamp at all. It doesn't have to be a sentiment, it can be literally any stamp. Any stamp will work with heat embossing. And as you can see, it gives us that lovely watermark effect. So you can actually just leave that like that if you would like, as a watermark effect when you're using your clear ink pads, as a very subtle finish onto your projects. But we want to actually heat emboss. So you don't have to work too quickly if you're using a pigment ink pad, as they do dry slowly, but I wouldn't leave that for a long period of time. I would get that embossing powder onto there as soon as possible, really. So I've chosen some white embossing powder, and all I've got is a piece of scrap card that folds in half just to pick up that mess, so I can get the embossing powder that I don't use back into the pot, because you don't actually use very much at all. So it might look like a little pot of embossing powder, but it will last a long time. So sprinkle your powder over and just tap off the excess like so. Don't blow on it, as you'll find that you do knock more embossing powder off than you would like. I'm just going to place that back in the pot, so you can see I hardly used any at all, which is brilliant. Now there's different grades of embossing powder within the craft market. If you have a really detailed stamp, like some of our rarer stamps are, you might want a fine embossing powder just to allow you to pick up that detail, which is perfect for your detailed stamps. That was just a regular embossing powder. You can get ultra thick embossing powders, which are brilliant for sort of your mixed media techniques, but it's completely up to you. There are lots of different options, lots of different finishes of embossing powders, glittery ones, clear, white as we've used here. It's completely up to you, whatever you'd like really. If you do find around the edge of your stamped image you do have some flecks of embossing powder, just get a dry paintbrush and just dust them off carefully. But if you do use an anti-static bag, you'll find that those pieces of stray embossing powder around the edge will be minimal. Now is the time to actually melt our embossing powder. So embossing powder is basically finely ground up bits of plastic, and by applying heat to that, what we're going to do is we're going to melt the design. So taking my heat gun, so just a little bit of caution when you are using a heat gun, as it does get very hot. I'm just going to turn it on, and I'm just going to get it up to temperature. That just minimises warping when I go to emboss my image, and make sure you keep your fingers out of the way, and then just position the gun, just let it heat up, and as soon as that embossing powder starts to melt and change, just move on. Don't hover over the same area for too long, you don't want to burn it. So just like so. So as soon as that embossing powder starts to change and starts to melt, make sure you move on to the next area. Don't waft your heat gun about, as you'll find you might blow little bits of embossing powder around, and also it will take longer. So make sure one area at a time and just move around. It'll take just a minute or two just to solidify, so it is slightly molten once you've just heated it. But you can see we get that gorgeous glossy finish, that raised surface, and doesn't it look fantastic, the white onto black. Now another great use for white embossing powder is onto craft card. That looks really fab. As I say, there's lots of different types of embossing powders on the market. So I've just taken here exactly the same stamp, but white card and a silver embossing powder. So how fab does that look? How exciting is heat embossing? Really easy to do. Not too many bits and pieces that you need within your crafty stash to do it. But once you start heat embossing, you'll definitely be hooked.